Welcome back to the Bitcoin Season 2 weekly live stream. This is me, Charlie, under Blockspace Media, doing a Bitcoin Season 2 live stream about midday every Monday. This is a metrics-heavy episode, live-streamed video on YouTube and X, pulling out a lot of charts, going over a lot of metrics and some news and some forward-looking indicators. This is where I pull out the charts and we see who's winning, who's losing, what Bitcoin looks like. Make sure to check out the other Blockspace Media podcasts and content, our newsletter on blockspace.media, as well as the Gwart Show and Mining Pod. The Bitcoin Season 2 podcast does a Monday, which is today, live stream, and a Thursday release of more in-depth interviews. So today, we have always interesting things happening on Bitcoin. We're going to talk about the OKX funny little consolidation issue, and Bitcoin fees are pumping because of that. And then also, I think another narrative that I'm going to inject in here is that BRC20s may get a little bit of a return. So without further ado, I'm going to launch into the metrics. Let's start with Bitcoin. So mempool.space, we see the current fee rate on Bitcoin is a little bit higher than it was last week. We're in the high 20s, but if you look at it, you actually see over here on the right, if you're listening to this, I'm looking at the mempool.space chart of the depth of transactions on the average mempool. We see a huge spike here. This is this past weekend. We'll talk about this. This was OKX kind of tripping over themselves, consolidating UTXOs. What is consolidating UTXOs? Well, you have to read our newsletter. I'll also review it here. Let's also take a look at Merch's Dune dashboard. Just what kind of transactions are happening on Bitcoin? Well, we see with this chart regular transactions versus BRC20 versus other types of transactions. Since April 20th, since the halving, the majority of transactions by number have been runes. We're talking 70, 60, sometimes 80% of the transactions by type on Bitcoin are runes transactions. If you watch previous streams, the number of the runes market is kind of up and down, but has been recovering a bit. That we had a bit of a pump last week and it's pulled back a bit. But we saw a bit of return of BRC20 transactions. Why? Well, we'll get into that. And then the other chart here that I think is really important is just the regular, just the fees dedicated to all these transactions. So again, I pulled up a chart which shows just the fees by transaction type, and fees are down comparatively, since the big rush over the last winter and the pump over the halving. But we have seen a little bit of a fee recovery where we're getting anywhere from 40 to 50 Bitcoin in fees per day across the board, from regular financial transactions to runes to BRC20 to other types of inscriptions. Another metric, and I don't see any other Bitcoin podcasts really covering this, is looking at the amount of TVL, total value locked, on what we might call Bitcoin L2s. Now, these are the various types of scaling or Bitcoin abstractions. I won't get into what makes an L2, but I love the bitcoinlayers.org. But let's look at the metrics. So we have Bob here from Interlay, partnered with Marathon Digital to merge mine this chain. Bob has is a majority wrapped Bitcoin, some deposits on Sovereign and TBTC. $300 million TVL, which is pretty significant. That's a lot of economic weight on that chain. We see daily deposits going into Bob have plateaued over the past month, but they've been pretty consistent since the end of March. Moving over to Mezzo from Thesis, we see about $126 million TVL, again, into the nine figures. 1,100 wrapped Bitcoin equivalent, and 6,600 addresses. We see another similar chart with with Mezzo here, where we had a large entrance of depositors in late March and early April, as Thesis promoted the Mezzo L2, and we've seen a bit of a plateau over the past month of depositors. Again, this, I don't believe withdrawal is yet available for this L2, but they do promote a yield-bearing mechanism on chain. Very interesting to watch this. And then the other kind of third major, I'm going to call it an L2 here again, is Merlin. This is largely popular in Asia, with a whopping $1.5 billion in TVL staked on this chain. You've heard me talk about personally on my own platforms and on some Blockspace pods, but I would be cautious, as the exit of this L2 seems a little under question. But $1.5 billion is 22,000 Bitcoin staked on this, and they have a staked ETH equivalent called Stone. 100,000 staked ETH according to their own metrics. So look at this chart here where we get to see the Bitcoin staked on Merlin chain since February of 24. We saw massive depositors throughout February and March. The Great Merlin unstaking just after the halving in April. And then it's been mostly plateaued since then. We saw a little bit of an increase in depositors onto this L2 in the first week of June. Let's move on to Ordinals, my favorite Dune dashboard from Data Always on Dune. 67 million inscriptions, the majority of which are BRC20. But I'm going to zoom out in a second here. So we have here a chart showing the kind of number of inscriptions happening per day. This includes JPEGs, but also BRC20s. And we saw inscriptions pretty much drop off a cliff and go to near zero comparatively right after the halving, as runes captured the narrative. Well, over the past couple weeks, really the past week, we've seen a bit of a return in inscription activity. This is almost exclusively driven by BRC20s from Unisat. I will talk about this again in a moment. So we are seeing inscription activity return. Again, it's mostly the JSON type 5-ticker pizza mint from an airdrop from Unisat. Let's see. The other charts on here, I will probably skip those. I'm just going to go straight to the marketplace dashboard from Domo. $4.1 million in aggregate marketplace volume to date across all major marketplaces, as tracked by Domo's dashboard. We see volume by marketplace having returned a bit over the past month, as the runes recover, and as I mentioned, the kind of the BRC20 resurgence. I think one of the things I want to point out here, and I'll talk about this a bit, is a kind of the marketplace wars or marketplace competition. You have Unisat, OKX, and Magic Eden as these three kind of tightness dominant marketplaces, and they do vie for competition, and they kind of eat into each other's market share, but it has this kind of cadence and rhythm to it, which is kind of dependent upon what the hot type of thing to mint is on Bitcoin. So we saw here, you see this line, this is 6:07, this is Friday of this past week, where we had a massive pump in marketplace transactions, which corresponded to an increase in marketplace volume. But you might notice, and it's hard to see on this chart here, the majority of this volume happened on Unisat. Unisat's been losing market share by both transaction activity and by volume over the past couple months. But when Unisat did their giant pizza airdrop, this generated a lot of new interest and demand for their marketplace, as it's BRC20 heavy. This is interesting to watch. Last week, this stream, I was talking about how Magic Eden had been increasingly their market share had been increasing, mainly eating into OKX and Unisat's market share. But we saw a couple days where Unisat did burst back on the scene. this past week as they distributed their pizza token. User growth on all these exchanges and marketplaces has begun to creep up a bit. Again, this chart shows unique users by marketplace. It's really just tracking like unique wallets, but I think this does mitigate a bit of the dual wallet count. But we saw user growth kind of plateau to a few thousand new users per day. But it seems to be ticking up again. I don't want to read too much into this little tick here over the past 3 or 4 days, but it does seem to be returning. We'll see how this goes. Let's move on to Runes. So Runes, going to the Genie data dashboard, Runes market overall market cap peaked this time last week at about $2.2 billion and has declined a bit. The mania did have to take a breather. We're now at about $1.8 billion for this overall market cap of all fungible tokens of the Runes type. This little graphic here, this fun icon from Genie Data shows Casey's health, referring to a joke that he made that he would commit seppuku if Runes did not have $1 billion in overall market cap. Well, Casey is safe. He's about 80% over the safe line, as Runes are at about $1.8 billion in total market cap. I'm going to be hitting this dashboard a lot until I find a better one. This is from Poshi on Genie Data. 24-hour volume on Runes, roughly 6 million, 15,000 unique sales. And we see the daily volume trends on Runes here declining a bit over the past couple days. This is a chart I tweeted out just a moment ago, which shows daily exchange volume percentage. I think this is really interesting. So discounting that event with Unisat, we see that Magic Eden is pretty close to becoming the super majority of transactions for Runes by volume. Magic Eden is currently doing about 60% of the volume for Runes, with OKX doing about 30%. Unisat with about 6%. This is now kind of looking almost like a duopoly across the marketplace space for Runes. Magic Eden had not really found market fit or market like traction for fungible tokens, as they'd been mainly like a JPEG marketplace over the past year. But as they were able to be first on the scene with Runes right at the halving, they certainly have seen a lot of increased market share. So it'll be interesting to see how this story develops. Again, look at this past 24 hours exchange volume distribution. This top bar is Magic Eden, $3.6 million. OKX with less than half that at $1.7 million, and Unisat at $500,000. The top 24-hour price gainers, I don't know if I'm going to spend too much time on this. I don't know if I want to make this like a ticker price show, but it's some random animal-themed tickers, and we have, that's probably all I will spend on that. Let's go into the news. The news this week, and I wrote about this in the Blockspace newsletter that came out this morning, is that you saw, as I said, a fee spike here this past weekend, which was from, again, that exchange OKX consolidating UTXOs. What does that mean? Well, I go into detail about what that actually means in our newsletter, but I'll summarize it here. Basically, as people deposit to an exchange, the Bitcoin they deposit is in the form of outputs. So they'll send Bitcoin to an exchange, and then that exchange has to manage the outputs that are pointed to them. We call those unspent transaction outputs, or UTXOs. So all these UTXOs, it's you kind of want to manage having how many of those you own. So you want to typically reduce or consolidate those. So these exchanges will have to create transactions to take, say, 100,000 UTXOs down to, say, 10,000. This is just good practice and reduces future fees. Well, OKX did a very not optimized UTXO consolidation this weekend, where they basically would send out in batches, where they'd have one batch estimate the new average fee to get into a block. This created a phenomenon where OKX was effectively bidding against their own batched transactions. And and kind of single-handedly ramping up the fees. This resulted in millions of dollars unnecessarily spent by OKX in order to consolidate their UTXOs. If they'd been just a little more patient or just a little more optimized, they would not have to spend what looks like to be about $17 million overall to consolidate these UTXOs over the weekend. So there's a great thread on this by Ord Data from this past week. I would recommend reading this if you're more of an Ordinals person to kind of understand how this works. And then I would also recommend reading a couple threads by Mononaut, who is one of the folks running mempool.space. So the final results for this is that it was about 2,385 transactions with about 357,000 inputs. They had an average fee rate of 246 sats per VByte and cost 254 Bitcoin in total fees. That could have been reduced significantly. So on this topic, I wrote a blog. Make sure you hit up blockspace.media, read the latest blog, subscribe to the newsletter, called Nobody is Ready for High Fees. And my point is that when you have these tier one exchanges doing these kind of UTXO consolidation flubs, and this is, they can stomach that loss. Like, that's expensive, but like they have large treasuries, and this gets into kind of R&D budgets. But like their challenge and their lack of optimization for UTXO consolidation extends down to the Bitcoin user base. So if you've been degenning BRC20s or if you've been DCAing Bitcoin, you could have you could face similar issues in the future. So I make this point in this newsletter where I might point out that this could be a looming problem for the Bitcoin ecosystem, I think this is kind of a technical issue which has to be solved at the UX side. So this could mean that people who think they have a lot of Bitcoin may actually not be able to access that Bitcoin without spending a lot in fees. So this is, I think, very important to keep your eye out for. And I'll be talking a lot about this on my personal Twitter and platforms, as well as on Blockspace channels. So the other kind of news, again, I'm going to go back to the Blockspace newsletter from last Friday, is that, this OpCat thing that the Taproot Wizards are pushing, that the Quantum Cats Ordinals collection promotes, is an opcode and soft fork onto Bitcoin, OpCat. This seemed like a fringe thing about 6 months ago. In the latest newsletter, I kind of break down both a timeline and a TLDR of where we are. That the BIP for OpCat was really only introduced in late fall of last year, and it seemed like a fringe thing. But in just a matter of 6 months, this OpCat topic has become pretty mainstream. In fact, it's found broad support among a lot of people who I think were not talking about it 9 months ago, from Adam Back to Starkware. It's live on Bitcoin Signet. You have some other people who are, I would say, they're pragmatists and they're conceding some ground on OpCat. I use the example of Shinobi as he is a critic of OpCat, but he's a pro-covenant and a pragmatist. So you see like this, people generally fall on the side of pro soft forking Bitcoin in the interest of solving what some people anticipate are some issues for scaling and UTXO ownership. Let's look forwards. Coming up next, we have Inscribing Nashville, which is the kickoff conference to the bigger Bitcoin Nashville in July. Blockspace will be at Inscribing Nashville in force. In fact, we'll actually have a whole kind of broadcast component to this Inscribing Nashville conference, where we will be doing interviews and in-depth content with the headliner speakers of the conference of Inscribing Nashville. So keep your eyes peeled. We'll be dropping some discount codes, and we will be promoting and kind of teasing what we're doing with this. speaking of teasing what we're doing with this, if you like and subscribe to Blockspace Media on wherever you stream, or YouTube, Spotify, Apple, whatever, RSS feed, on Thursday, I have an interview coming out with Leonidas. Yes, we're talking meme coins, specifically Dog Go to Moon. What could be the first billion-dollar meme coin on Bitcoin. So I had a great conversation with him. That's dropping later this week. Make sure to like and subscribe, and notification bell. So without further ado, that is the Bitcoin Season 2 weekly update. Make sure to turn on notifications, hit the subscription button at the various platforms, and I will see you on various Blockspace Media content platforms. Thanks so much.